Hi, I just wanted to make this short video really in relation to Ken O'Keefe's recent video on fake news, BBC Criminality, 9/11 and more, part 1 of 2. I'll leave you the link to this video under my video here, and I do advise you to watch it and to wait for part 2 and to subscribe to Ken O'Keefe and support his work as well. So, you know, he is making progress in that, and he's giving a lot of effort to a lot of very worthy causes, and especially Palestine. And, you know, he hasn't shied away from the very serious issue of child abuse presently afflicting our planet, which what would we expect considering we're being governed by, well, psychopaths. Now, I agree with everything that Ken O'Keefe is saying here about the BBC. I fully support him, and I think a lot of the British public now are waking up to some very serious suspicions and concerns now related to the BBC and the fact that they appear, or you know, are controlled by other powers beyond the British public. Now, as Ken O'Keefe rightly exposes here, the British public are paying, well, we're forced licence payers, and so therefore the BBC does actually belong to us. And it was quite a few years ago now, I did unsuccessfully try to organise to get some initiative going for the British public to set up their own union as BBC investors, okay, and it just never took off. And I'm such an isolated individual, you know. I'm not one that attracts support as you can see, and as you know, I'm just not what is known as a credible person in this society, so nobody took any notice of it. But if they had have done, it would have been a fantastic thing, and I really hope that the British people do it, because we should, you know, and this is one of the problems when a public just is literally comatose to what is actually going on in the world around them, you know, other than how can that world serve their interests in whichever way, you know, not in really questioning as to whether those interests are actually being adequately served, or are those interests actually even valid in a sense of lawful compassion, as it were, and ethics, and in the interest of balance, you know. So as I've cited before, you know, nobody bothers to think about how a box of tea bags called Yorkshire tea, okay, arrives into Britain, arrives on our supermarket shelves. What are the processes that go behind that? And you know, that is the capacity to be human, you see, is to have a brain that functions and can follow a train of thought to arrive at an understanding about what actually is going on. Whereas, and this is what is meant when we, you know, people talk about people having blinkered minds, in the sense that their perceptions are blinkered, in that they just see the supermarket and they just know that you go to the supermarket and you pick a box of tea bags off the shelf and you go home and you make your cup of tea and you sit and watch BBC News, and you just accept everything that the BBC tells you, and you just blindly pay your BBC licence, and and yet you aren't, as a person, being represented. The British public are not being adequately represented, and they're being deliberately misinformed by what is presented to them as an officially endorsed, credible news provider. And, you know, then you find out that, oh, they've been protecting people like Jimmy Savile. And, you know, being biased, presenting the news in a biased way, as Ken O'Keefe shows, you know, Anthony Benn, God bless him, you know, the BBC covered the brutal Israel attacks against Palestine with bias, and they even refused to broadcast a charity that was set up for the people of Gaza, who were just mercilessly bombed by Israel. And so it's a very serious issue when your news provider is not actually telling you the truth, is showing you an unbalanced picture of what is actually going on in the world. So therefore they are misinforming people, and that is a serious thing, because our mind is a very sensitive organ. Okay, our brain is a sensitive organ, and it's as if people just are numb now. That by the time people reach adulthood, they're just numb to the damages. You know, that if somebody came and really banged you in the head, hit you on the head with a frying pan, you'd be really angry, wouldn't you? You know, it's like, well, why have you done that? Somebody just comes up out of the blue, whang, bangs you on the head with a frying pan, and you're dazed, and, you know, and then later you're outraged. So you shout at the person, you know, you're angry. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? Well, imagine if you were being forced to pay somebody every year a lump sum in order that at any given time they can just suddenly appear and bang you on the head with a frying pan. Well, what the BBC are doing with their news, okay, with their news reports, oh, you don't feel the physical pain of being hit on the head with a frying pan, but your brain is responding in the exact same way. And people are getting angry, and they're taking on board all these imbalanced statements and positions and opinions that are being promoted by the BBC, whether it's overtly, directly through their BBC News, or covertly as things shown in their programmes, okay? Then that is what's happening. You're dazed and confused. You're dazed and confused. And once you realise the enormity of that it is the most terrible abuse. Just because you don't feel it physically, just because it doesn't leave a bruise, our consciousness is what makes us alive. Take your consciousness away. Take your brain away. What are you? Do you even want to be alive? Would you want to be alive as a vegetable? No, because your consciousness, your brain, our thoughts, thinking, understanding, that is what makes us human beings. And so what is being done, once you understand, if you have any inkling of psychology, once you understand that this is really serious. This is more serious than being banged on the head with a frying pan, because at least you know you've been banged on the head with a frying pan, and you might be able to identify the culprit and get something done about it. But when you don't know you've been banged on the head by a frying pan, and you're just wandering around dazed and confused and willingly paying out the money without realising that that is what you're paying for. Seriously, it's time to get real, people. Now, I mentioned earlier about this idea of the British licence fee paying public, BBC licence fee paying public, to get together to form our own union. I'm not suggesting, you know, I'm not saying, oh, I want to be head of this BBC People's Union. No, I don't, okay? I might consider it. I might consider getting involved in some official capacity, writing. I'm particularly good at writing, especially some legal documents on behalf of the public, as in terms of setting the whole thing up. I happily do that, okay? But as for the positions and things like that, we need to appoint people to lead the BBC Public Licence Fee Payers Union, and that legally we are investors, that we are recognised as the prime investors of the BBC, and therefore the BBC's prime duty and focus of attention is on the British public and what is going on with the British public, what the British public's concerns are, and that in no way whatsoever should any other corporation, corporate interest, have any involvement in the BBC, which is run by paid for by its investors, okay? Because then not even the government has a right, not even the government should have a right to dictate what the BBC says. Because in a nation that apparently is democratic and lawful, any democratically elected and lawful government has got absolutely nothing to fear from the people's, the public's news provider, from the public-owned BBC, okay? Of course, nobody expects the BBC to then become immediately anti-government or anti-anything, because that's the whole point, isn't it? Is that they are non-biased, that they present both sides of an argument, and at the end of the day, if one side of the argument appears stronger than the other side of the argument, that's got nothing to do with the BBC. That's just reality, isn't it? And then the people can witness that reality and make their own minds up on which side they feel the scales of the BBC in their unbiased news reporting, well, which side do the scales fall on? And, oh, well, actually, yeah, the evidence seems more to support this, you know, but there is that case, but the evidence seems to more support this. This is the idea of non-bias. Non-bias doesn't mean that, oh, well, you know, we're going to only present this much of the argument on this side, because if we present the rest of their argument, then it'll counterbalance too heavily against the opposing argument. You know, being non-biased means just presenting the facts, and then the public, intelligent public, not operating in a daze of confusion, can make up their minds, and they can understand how they would like things to go. How would we like our government to act on our behalf as our representatives? And, you know, so the other reason why I'm making this video, which is really one of the prime reasons as well, because, you know, of all the negativity against the BBC, and people might think somebody like myself is totally against the BBC, and, you know, I would advocate everybody just stop paying your TV licences. Well, you know, that is another important point, that on the plus side of the BBC, because, you know, we've just discussed the downside, let's be non-biased and show the good and the positive and negative, okay? So we've discussed the negative, but the positive aspect of the BBC is that the first point is that it is a huge employer within Britain. There's a lot of people whose lives and livelihoods depend on the BBC. It employs a huge staff. And the other important point is that the BBC does produce programming. It is a platform that people can watch various programmes and not be constantly have to deal with interruptions of people talking about, you know, your death, you're soon approaching death, and whether or not you need life insurance, or are you over 50 and if you pay £5 a month or something, or £5 a week, they'll pay for your funeral. Have you thought about your funeral? You know, do people really want those kind of things when they're watching TV? Do they really want to suddenly be thinking about laxatives or a splitting headache? You know, but and that is another important point, because the BBC, in that sense, that is a very important point, is protecting the British consciousness from that constant bombardment, from that constant disassociation, which equally causes psychological problems within the brain. You know, I'm not saying it turns people crazy, but in a way it does, because it's a distraction. And people, again, don't recognise the damage that it does. That's just a little knock on the head every so often, isn't it? You know, now here's 3 minutes of a little taps on the head. And, you know, that, again, really, if people understood that kind of advertising that's repetitive and constantly cuts into something that you've focused all your attention on, and then suddenly it's cut in, interspersed with these 3 minutes of head banging stuff, you know, it is really assault and battery of the brain. Understand it. Understand you're a conscious human being. Your consciousness is what makes you human. Your consciousness. Our consciousness. Assault and battery is what is going on with these constant intersections of advertisements. So, maybe we should set up an advertising channel. So if people have got a problem, they can click on the channel, type in their problem, and there'll be a series of advertisements for them to go through to whatever problem they've got. Okay? And let's just have an advertisement advertising that channel every so often. You know, that makes sense. That makes sense, because it's operating on people's right of choice, and it isn't just assuming that, oh yes, well, now we've got their attention on this programme, now we can bang them on the head with this. Oh, by the way, but this is what is paying for these programmes. So basically, us being subjected to a constant, regular head battering is paying for these other stations, the commercial TV channels. So, obviously, our only alternative really is the BBC, and for us to collectively become investors in that our licence fee makes us an investor, and that we have our own union. You know, licence fee pays union, or licence fee pays investors board, okay? And that instead of discarding the BBC, instead of us all saying, oh no, we're not going to pay our licence fee anymore, instead of us all doing that instead we do continue to pay our licence fees, knowing that at the same point we're keeping people employed, and those people are performing a service. And, you know, regardless of what I say about the BBC, on many levels, I do accept they do produce some very good programmes, very well written, well produced, giving information, sharing important information, news, you know, on all kinds of subjects and issues. So I think it is important to recognise the bathwater and to, yes, throw it out, but actually to keep the baby, okay? Keep that baby, because the BBC needs to be, well, it needs to be revolutionised, doesn't it? It needs to be internally revolutionised. And in that sense, you know, I appeal to the BBC staff now to you get involved in this as well, you know, to demand that that there are big changes, and to ask questions yourself, you know, because the BBC is still helping to cover up child abuse cases and to negate them. They're still doing that. They're still presenting biased news presentations. They still never ever question our government, which they ought to be doing, because the public are questioning our government. The public asked all the questions that Ken O'Keefe asked about 9/11, about the Iraq War, about what's going on in Palestine and Israel, and so many other questions that the public have asked, but the government has made its mind up on a particular narrative, but the public have got evidence to seriously question that narrative, but the BBC will not present it. The BBC won't cover the 50,000 people on a demo in Britain, but it's quite happy to toddle off to Syria to focus on a few ISIS so-called rebels. You know, this is what is going on. And as I say, it is about time that the BBC started focusing on what is happening in our country and what is happening to the people here. Because what we do in Britain today will have a huge impact on the external world as well, because this country, the powers that are governing this country, that are controlling our BBC, that are battering our brains, assault and battery against our consciousness daily, okay, they have a huge influence on what is happening in the external world, and they have been committing all kinds of crimes in the external world, in our name, apparently in our name. Except, you know, according to them, we don't have any names. We're just cattle. We're just cattle on their corporate farm. But we're not. We're not cattle, are we? The BBC are coming knocking on our door, asking us for funds, like demanding and threatening us with prison and fines and all kinds. There's people actually been in prison for not paying the licence fee. Women, mothers have been put in prison for not paying their licence fee. You know, this is a very, very serious thing that, well, I don't know if mothers have been put in prison, they might, or if they've been threatened. I'm sure I heard a story years ago, very many years ago, of people being put in prison. One was a mother, was put in prison for not paying the licence fee. But, you know, I might be mistaken, but still, people are being threatened with legal action if they don't pay their licence fee. And it is a very, very, very serious issue when that service isn't even operating on our behalf, that it's actually operating against our better interests as human beings. As human beings have a right, we have a right to be correctly informed. And we need it, because truth and facts, reality, that's food for our intelligence, that's food for the mind. Reality, that is what created us, is the universal reality that created the reality of our solar system, and our sun, the star at the centre of it, and our planet. Reality created those things. Reality created us. And if we don't have access to reality, if we are being denied reality and fed a distorted, maligned version of reality, that will impact us in so many ways. Assault and battery, and the bruises that are in our consciousness are being manifest as what? Manifest as all kinds of crimes against each other and ourselves. And, you know, we're talking about a BBC and this whole narrative of this new world order that's going on today, all of it founded on the narratives of history, which we know for a fact today were based largely on myth, absolute fantasy, and actually downright lies and evil that was put forward purely to control people and rob people of their rights and give this explanation, that explanation, until, you know, eventually people realise that they've been conned. What, centuries later we realise that, oh, actually there's no such thing as royal blood. Oh, but they're there now, you know. So, look, please just consider the things that I've said. Please pick up on them, you know. I'm just a single person out here just putting forward my ideas. I think they're good ideas, I think they're important ideas, and that's why I'm sharing them with the public. And Ken O'Keefe is a very important figure in what's going on in as far as bringing change to the world today. And, you know, I ask you, please listen to his video, listen to part 2 when it comes out, look at his other videos, and, you know, let us all come together. Let us recognise the people who are speaking from a heart that is aligned with a rational, compassionate head, okay? That is sharing sanity, that's sharing sense and sanity, and has some positive ideas about how to move forward into the future. And one of those, you know, Ken O'Keefe is doing his One World Citizen project, and there are so many other people that have got other initiatives, you know, Renard Bernard, his Bank of Joy, and Michael telling us Ubuntu, and the Bradbury Pound movement in Britain, and the Lawful Bank, and, you know, there's so many positive things that we can be putting our energies into right now. In particular, demanding that our children receive the full benefits of EU child protection directives. You know, yeah, okay, we're out of the EU, but it doesn't mean to say that we can't have those directives. We paid enough money into the EU, didn't we? We might as well get something out of it, at least for the children. You know, and it's those kind of things that we want the BBC to be talking about and promoting, along with all its other things, okay? Along with the mainstream political parties. Please show us what the people are doing outside of these corrupted authorities. Please accept BBC, they are corrupt. BBC staff, accept that your senior management teams, who are they serving? It's our BBC, and I don't want to lose it, okay? And I want to make it ours, and I don't want it to collapse and for all those people to lose their jobs, and then what is left for the people, you know. I think that we need to reclaim the BBC, to actually claim it as ours, and to support change there, and to support the staff in bringing change to the BBC, and, as I say again, to support people like Ken O'Keefe in particular. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to listen. I hope that it's give you some ideas, that it's inspired people, and that somehow together, you know, we will keep making sense, and we can deliver a brighter future for the children. So thank you, and God bless.